Hey everyone, so today we're going to start off our developmental psychology unit by not only introducing what developmental psychology is, but also in talking about brain development in terms of how the brain develops over childhood and adolescence. So in terms of talking about developmental psychology, the field really develops and grows from the fact that psychologists want to show special interest in the process of how and why people develop through life. And that's really at the heart of what developmental psychology means. And so it looks at stages of aging throughout the lifespan of the individual, but in IB, we're going to focus more on the childhood and adolescent years. And so there's three goals of developmental psychology. The first one is to describe the processes in human development that are normative. So common to humanity, common to everyone. Of course, there are different developmental processes that occur very different in certain people based on, whether it's a handicap, whether it's environmental factors that have caused this, genetic factors that have caused this, what have you. But most of the time they're focused on normative human development. The second one is to explain the reasons for these processes. And then the third is to proactively guide and intervene where needed. So what are we doing with this information? We're going to try and aid in the developmental processes of the individuals to experience the best from these changes. And so this comes to the point where we're talking about the idea that most people's developmental processes are actually not normative, but idiographic, which is to mean that they're not easily explained by standard models of how people grow and change. So the first section we're going to look at, and that starts today with the brain development and continues on with looking at two different cognitive theories from Piaget and Vygotsky, which we'll talk about in different videos. But really our development as a learner comes down to a couple different principles. The first is that learning is a lifelong process. Your learning does not end with the end of high school or college or grad school. You continue to learn, maybe not in as formal of ways, but you continue to learn throughout your life, and should continue to push to learn and grow as much as possible. And then our ability to deal cognitively with the world is grown through several processes, both cognitively and biologically. So not only are we affected by that environmental growth, which changes the structures through which we store information, but also biologically we grow and we change as well. So really, brain development comes down to a principle of brain change that we talked about earlier in the course, and that's neuroplasticity. So as we talked about, neuroplasticity is the continued development of specialized neural networks after time or after injury. And the brain has the lifelong ability to change. But this is especially true and especially grows the most in childhood. And this is often promoted and supported by continued stimulating and demanding activities, which continue to push the nature of where our brains are at. So in the normal process of childhood and adolescent brain development, there's a few different changes that have been shown to take place for most every person. The first is that the brain doubles in size between birth and young adulthood. So by the age of 6, 95% of our brain structure is complete. And it's that final 5% that really starts to grow during the time of puberty and continues into, or can continue into, the mid-20s of our life. And the most profound changes in adolescence is the growth of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex processes impulse control, assesses evidence, decision making, and planning. And that's why we rapidly get better at those things as time goes on. That doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, though. The second one is that throughout the period from birth to childhood, the folds on the brain surface become far more complex in the cerebral cortex. And so these areas help to process cognitive and emotional information. And again, another reason why we suddenly get much better at those things as well. The third, neurons within the brain grow in complexity, degree of connectivity, and speed in processing information or stimuli. And they also develop myelin coverings, and these accelerate the speed by which messages can travel. And this allows us to really process more complex stimuli more quickly. The fourth and final one, differences in personal learning experiences also affect the rates of growth of different learning associated networks in the brain. And this can be controlled by brain plasticity and also biologically. Some normal cognitive development and progress in learning is age-related and genetically related. And so really when we think about brain development, there are elements of our biological, cognitive, and sociocultural levels of analysis that really affect the direction that our brain development goes. So as far as structural changes in the brain, and this follows, biological changes, they are usually broken down into 4 stages. The first one is neurogenesis. And genesis just means creation, so it would follow that this means that it refers to the production of new neurons. And this is mostly finished in the gestation period before birth. Neurons are overproduced. We have billions upon billions of neurons in our brain, and they are overproduced to account for the future normal process of cell death, but also to allow us to have more neurons than we might ever need. Our brains are preparing us for anything. The second one is the migration of neurons to their correct location. And at about 9 weeks after conception, our neurons start to migrate to their current location. And they travel along what are called glial fibers. And these connect the innermost parts of the brain to the cortical layers of the brain. The third is in differentiation. And it is the development of the network of connections between neurons. This starts shortly after conception and continues until about age 2. And at about the point of 40,000 synapses per second at some point, we really are growing in terms of the number of neurons that we have. And this often ends up plateauing and then reducing the number of synapses after. And then the fourth one is that after we have created so many neurons, our brain finds that we have to be more efficient with the room that we use. And so in order to allow ourselves to grow and to become more efficient as thinkers, pruning ends up happening. And this is sort of like when you cut branches off a tree in order to make it seem more beautiful, but also this allows the process of greater growth in the future. For the branches to be able to grow out farther and the roots to grow stronger. But with pruning, by the end of puberty, about 50% of the originally formed synapses are eliminated. And this can reach a pruning level of 100,000 synapses per second. And so due to this fact, children have more synapses to adults, but because cutting out some of these extraneous neurons causes for greater efficiency, adults have more efficient thinking because of that. So that leads us into the first experiment we're going to look at today, and this is one that we've seen before in the biological unit, and also I believe in the cognitive unit. So this is the BA-DA experiment. So it really demonstrated that children's speech perception is reorganized by the end of the first year. And it also supported theories that we are born with abilities for language within our brain. So the study used English and Hindi words. Two phonemes were used, ba and da, but adult Hindi speakers would hear three categories, ba, da, and capital D, da. And adult English speakers would not hear the Hindi da that we talked about just a second ago. So the aim was to see what babies could hear and at what age developmental changes occurred. And so they took two groups of infants, ages 6 to 8 months, and a group aged 11 to 13 months, and they participated in the experiment. And so they used a head turn method where the babies were conditioned to turn their heads away from a researcher to a box with a toy animal that had clapping cymbals and would keep saying certain phonemes. And the babies heard random pairings of the sounds ba, da, and da. And what they found was that babies who were 6 to 8 months discriminated between the Hindi da, right? They could hear it. These were all English-speaking babies. But the babies 11 to 13 months could no longer hear that Hindi da sound. And that's showing you that this pruning process is already taking place, right? Our ability to hear this and ability to recognize these phonemes have been eliminated because they are not central to our experience as human beings, as English-speaking human beings. That does not mean that the person cannot learn Hindi in the future. And so, again, there's this evidence that a baby's brain reorganizes, that a baby's brain changes and grows during the first year of life. The next one is KUHL and GAXIOLA from 2008. And the aim of this was to see whether social interaction was required for developing language potentials. And to also, in the same way that the BA-DA experiment from WERKER and LALONDE did, was to see under what circumstances the brain sort of grows and cuts out some of these universal language learning features of our brain. So they had infants hear Mandarin during 12 25-minute sessions where a Mandarin speaking researcher played with the children and read stories. They had a control group where the English-speaking babies had the same sessions but in English. And then two other groups heard either Mandarin or English stories through a recording. And so children were tested with Mandarin words that differed from English words while measuring their processing in these sessions. And so the results showed that children learning Mandarin through direct social interaction, where the researcher was in the room with them, learned the most sounds as evidenced by the processing. And this was replicated across other languages and samples. Those that were not in with the researcher did not sort of learn Mandarin and did not process Mandarin. And so some of the conclusions that we can create from this, since we're not in class to look at this, were again that our brain sort of reorganizes. And not only is it biologically based that it reorganizes, but it's also environmentally based for us to be able to interact directly with people in order to learn language. Just simply listening to a recording is not necessarily enough to produce changes in how our brain is wired. An important feature of brain development research are three different perspectives on brain development. The first is biological. They focus on the structural changes of the brain, or a structure relationship. The cognitive focus on the development of cognitive functions, or the function relationships. And then sociocultural. These focus on environmental influences on the process of development. And so the interaction of these three approaches is often done to study whether biological and cognitive changes are connected, or structure-function relationships. Do these things happen at the same time? To learn not only more about brain development, but also learn more about the role of biology in cognitive factors. And so if structural and functional relationships occur at the same time, it can be taken that brain and cognitive development are related. So we have this study that we're going to see several times throughout this unit, and this is from Piaget and INHELDER from 1956. And this is quite a famous study within cognitive research. So the aim was to see whether children who are less than 7 years old are able to see the model of a mountain scene from their own viewpoint only. And this is based on the idea of theory of mind, in which someone can sort of see things from the other person's perspective. And so children 4 to 8 were presented with 3 papier-mâché mountains of various colors, each with something different on the top: a red cross, a covering of snow, or a ski chalet. The children then walked around the model, explored it, sat on one side while a doll was placed on one of the other sides. And they were shown 10 pictures with different views of the model, including the dolls in their own. And they were asked to select the picture that represented the doll's view. And so here we see exactly what's going on. They have 3 mountains between them and the doll. Then they're asked to say which picture represented the doll's experience. So what they found was that 4-year-olds chose the picture matching their own view, and 6-year-olds showed some understanding of other viewpoints, but often selected the wrong picture. And then 7 to 8-year-olds consistently chose the picture of the doll's view. And so the conclusion was that 4-year-olds were unaware that there are viewpoints other than their own. But in terms of brain development, the fact that children under 7 may be subject to egocentric illusion, where they fail to understand the viewpoints of others, may point to larger brain development changes that are taking place, which lead to cognitive changes. And so, because they are suddenly able at a biological age, and with great consistency in this study, it may support the view of these structure-function relationships, that biological changes occur, and then we get cognitive changes because of that. So a few evaluation points. Since mountains were outside the experience of many, the answers could have been one of a lack of understanding of the task or subject matter, and not necessarily because of theory of mind. Now, in terms of physical brain development, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but overall the volume of the brain increases as the child grows in size, but it stops right around the point of puberty. So brain size growth stops at about 11 years old for girls and 15 years old for boys. And in terms of gray matter volume, this is brain tissue that contains synapses, so very, very important. These increase in amount and then decrease in volume a few years earlier than the total volume changes. And you can ignore my misspelling of decrease here. But the amount seems to vary in terms of the maturation of the area. On the other hand, we have white matter. So this is brain tissue containing all the connections between the gray matter, right? So they work sort of in a way in concert with that. So it continues to increase in volume throughout childhood and adolescence. And these increase throughout childhood and adolescence means that the child's brain can increase connectivity as needed to accommodate learning. So with physical brain development, the first areas of the brain to develop include the motor and sensory areas. As the child begins to make sense of the world, these areas are then ready to map onto higher order functions. As we said earlier, also, the last area to really develop is the prefrontal cortex. Our ability to do things like judge, decision make, and do impulse control are all being developed as we go into puberty and beyond. And it really helps to moderate our emotional decision making, to make wiser decisions. There's also a few influences on brain development. And the first of these is more biological, and that's genes and environment, or at least, sorry, genes. And then also gender differences can also influence brain development, and toxins as well. So genes and environment, gender, and then toxins as well. So as far as genes and environment go, although developmental changes appear to be universal, there's a lot of evidence that the development of the brain is affected by both genes and the environment. And we talked about this in the biological unit when we talked about genes and behavior. And so genes seem to determine the changes in gray and white matter volume and age. But heritability seems to impact white matter increasing and gray matter decreasing with age. And these become differences from the norm because, and they become more obvious with age for white matter and less obvious for gray matter. They may also trigger disorders at certain ages as well. For instance, like schizophrenia is oftentimes triggered within early adulthood, like 18 to 21, 22 years old. And it usually affects males. And there may be a genetic cause for that. In terms of gender differences, there are gender differences in the likelihood of developing neuropsychotic disorders. Like I talked about with schizophrenia, males are more likely to develop schizophrenia than females for whatever reason. And respective volume of white, gray, and total volume of the brain also varies between genders. The thickness of the brain tissue varies and not the anatomical structures that differ. But again, I cannot say this enough, the capacity for learning is the same between genders on average. The last point I want to make is about toxins. And toxins in the environment are also thought to affect brain development. Things like excessive exposure to drugs, alcohol, vitamin A, nicotine, insecticides, mercury, lead can all affect brain development and our learning potential. All right, with that being said, if you have any questions on brain development, this is obviously going to be a topic that we talk about throughout developmental psychology, and we have talked about. But if you have any questions, please come find me. I hope all of you have a great day, and take care.